Yeah, really interesting how these open primaries work, though, because, John, wouldn't it kind of skew the vote if you've got Democrats and, to a lesser extent, independents voting for Nikki Haley in these primaries? When it comes to the general election, those voters aren't going to turn around and vote necessarily for Joe Biden. So how does it kind of skew our thinking of where this might be headed in November?
Yeah, I think there's a very important dynamic that's playing out in the Republican primary, and it's a 70-30 split right now. We see that 30% is about the benchmark for Nikki Haley, especially in these open primaries, where she's mobilizing independents and some Democrats, as well as Republican voters, to vote for her and against Donald Trump. We also know that 30% of the Republican Party doesn't believe that the 2020 election was stolen. And we know that 30% of the Republican Party would not vote for Donald Trump if he's the
Only
nominee,
30%
if he
don't
was
think it was
convicted.
stolen.
If he was Yeah, 30% don't
It's
think
pretty
he's stolen.
depressing.
30% would not vote for Donald Trump if he's convicted of a crime. And so what we see here is that there's definitely 30% of voters that are being mobilized right now in these states, especially in states with open primaries, where Nikki Haley's been on the ground there. She's been messaging against why Donald
Yeah.
Trump is unfit for office. And these are going to be the voters that will ultimately decide the 2024 election in November. Are they going to come home to the Republican Party, or are they going to continue to vote against Donald Trump and vote against Republican extremism like they did in 2020, like they did in 2022 in the midterms, and as we're seeing in these states in 2024?
John, if it's only 30% in that cohort, isn't it all just a bit of a waste of time and energy? Because it looks like Trump's going to be the guy anyway.
Look, 30% of the Republican Party not voting for Donald Trump in November would be catastrophic for Donald Trump's chances of beating Joe Biden in 2024. 10%, 15% of the Republican Party not supporting Donald Trump as their nominee secures Joe Biden's election. What we
So
need to
what
do is build
happens
an
with that, John?
anti-Trump
Sorry to
coalition here.
interrupt. Yeah, what happens with that 15 to 30%? Do they just not turn out and vote in November, or are they switching their vote to Joe Biden? What's the prediction here?
Yeah, I think these voters are definitely up for grabs. We know right now that voters are dissatisfied with both their options come November, whether it be
Yeah.
Donald Trump or Joe Biden. But what we do know is that on top of voters' minds right now is their dissatisfaction with Joe Biden, and they have
Yeah.
forgotten what they don't like about Donald Trump. But when we have these races and we have these primaries and we have a candidate like Nikki Haley telling the truth to voters about why Donald Trump is unfit, that enthusiasm comes back. They're reminded why they couldn't support Donald Trump in the past and why they don't want to see him become president again.
Yeah.
And so I think these voters are up for grabs. And we have to remember, too, the swing states that decided the 2020 election, we're talking of tens of thousands of votes, extremely
Yeah.
small margins in these states. So if we're peeling off percentages of Donald Trump's vote share from the 2020 election, that's not only going to grow the anti-Trump coalition, but it's going to increase Joe Biden's margins in some of these swing
Okay,
states.
but what does your experience and research say here? If there is 30% within the Republican Party that are, let's say they're never Trumpers, they're hardcore, they don't want to see Trump back in the White House, they certainly don't love Joe Biden though, do they just not turn out and vote in November? Or can you see some of them holding their nose and actually voting for Joe Biden? That seems an extraordinary proposition, to be honest.
Yeah, I know we have research that says that the 2020 election was decided by historical Republican voters, past Donald Trump supporters, folks that historically have always voted for the Republican Party, switching party lines, putting country first, and voting for Joe Biden in the 2020
Wow.
election. That's what got Joe Biden elected in 2020. It's why the red wave in the 2022 midterms in states like Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, where extremist Republican MAGA candidates were on the ballot, lost those races. And we're going to see the same dynamic in 2024.
Okay, that's really interesting because I was in the US for the midterms and it was a pretty terrible result for Donald Trump, to be honest, and the people that he backed. But is that still relevant now? Can you still see those same patterns emerging in November?
What I know from doing focus groups with swing voters, Republican voters, especially with these voters that we call double doubters, folks that have negative views of both Joe Biden and Donald Trump, they have not yet internalized that they're going to get a rematch of the 2020 election. There's lots of thoughts of third parties. Maybe Nikki Haley pulls out a surprise victory. Maybe
Right.
Joe Biden's not at the top of the ticket. Once voters start to internalize that these are going to be their options come November, and they're reminded that Donald Trump said the 2020 election was stolen, committed an insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. When his legal issues become top of mind for voters as these criminal cases continue into the fall, it will remind voters of why they couldn't support Donald Trump in the past, what they don't like about Donald Trump. We need to get Donald Trump back on the top of mind of voters. And that's why Nikki Haley running a campaign hard at Donald Trump, explaining why he's unfit for office. We see her do well in these states where she's been
Yeah.
able to mobilize the anti-Trump coalition, because we know that when Donald Trump is on top of voters' minds, it is a turnout machine for Democrats.
Yeah, really interesting that you say that, though, because the never Trumpers, the anti-Trumpers, are matched, aren't they? If there's 30% never Trumpers, there is a 30% rusted on Trump's our guy, isn't there?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that the never Trump contingent of the Republican Party is 30%. The 30% that Nikki Haley is mobilizing right now could very well go back home to Donald Trump in November. And that's why it's super important that groups message to these voters that Nikki Haley understands who her voters are and understands that her support is being driven by anti-Trump sentiment. You're completely right, though. There's 30% of the Republican Party that's also completely dug in. The always Trump faction of the Republican Party is always going to show up to vote for Donald Trump whenever he's on the ballot. But Donald Trump has created a gulf between the Republican Party and historical Republican swing voters. And every day that Trump continues to become more extreme, become more unhinged, when he posts on True Social about terminating parts of the Constitution, that gap between Donald Trump and swing voters gets bigger every day.
John, fascinating to talk to you today. We really appreciate your time.